the oldest and most secretive organizations in the world, which documented membership among heads of state, military leaders, and intelligence figures across multiple countries and eras. What they actually do behind closed doors has never been fully mapped. The theory here is that the Men in Black aren't a government operation at all, that they're something older, answering to an authority that exists parallel to governments rather than within them. An organization that has been managing certain kinds of knowledge for centuries, long before Roswell, long before any of this had a name. It sounds like a stretch. There's no hard evidence connecting the Freemasons to MIB encounters directly. But the reason researchers keep coming back to it is the scale. If this is a government operation, it's an operation coordinating across dozens of countries with a consistency that strains belief. That level of coordination implies either a global government apparatus that doesn't officially exist, or something else entirely, something with longer roots. And then there's the theory that breaks the framework completely, because government agents, even the most elite covert operatives, are human. They have tells. They make mistakes. They get tired, they get hungry, lose their composure under pressure. The Men in Black, according to the people who'd encountered them, don't seem to do any of those things. One researcher spent years collecting accounts and arrived at a conclusion he himself described as deeply uncomfortable. That the beings appearing at these witnesses' doors are not human. That they are something that has learned to copy human existence well enough to pass at a distance, but not quite well enough to pass at a kitchen table, under ordinary light, in an ordinary room, over the course of an ordinary conversation. Think about what the witnesses consistently describe. Skin that looks wrong in a way they struggle to articulate. Eyes slightly too large, hidden behind dark glasses, regardless of the lighting conditions. A voice that sounds synthesized, not accented, not unusual, but synthesized, like a recording of speech rather than speech itself. An inability to generate the small, involuntary movements that human beings produce constantly without thinking. The micro expressions, the fidgeting, the blink. One witness, when asked years later what she remembered most clearly about the two men who visited her, thought about it for a long time. That they didn't blink, she said. The whole time they were there. Not once. She paused. I thought about it a lot over the years. Whatever they were, I don't think they needed to. The theory that follows from this goes underground, literally, that whatever these beings are, they operate from somewhere beneath the surface, somewhere they can monitor human activity, track awareness of their presence, and deploy when the exposure gets too close. The sensitivity to light, always the dark glasses, always avoiding direct sunlight, points to something adapted for environments humans don't inhabit. And yeah, it sounds like science fiction. Most of the people who've reported these encounters know exactly how it sounds. They report it anyway. Here's what we know for certain. The accounts exist, hundreds of them, across decades, across continents, from people with no connection to each other, describing the same suit, the same face, the same feeling that whatever was standing in front of them was operating by a different set of rules than everyone else in their lives. We know that Albert Bender shut down his organization and stayed quiet for a decade. We know Herbert Hopkins destroyed his research the same night something with painted lips and no eyebrows sat in his living room and made a coin disappear. We know Harold Dahl handed over a photograph, the only proof he had, and never spoke publicly about that morning again. We know that two figures walked through a hotel in Niagara Falls in 2008, managed an entire floor of guests, and left no trace in any record of ever having been there. What we don't know is who sent them, what they're protecting, Whether the thing they're hiding is something the government found, or something the government fears, or something that has been here so much longer than either of them that the distinction barely matters. One thing cuts through all the theories, all the speculation, all the attempts to explain this away. The accounts don't contradict each other. Across 60 years, across a dozen countries, from people who had no way of knowing about each other's experiences, the descriptions are the same. That kind of consistency is either the most elaborate collective hallucination in recorded history, or it's something else. I will let you decide. Okay, that's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. And if you had your own encounter, or if you know someone who has, you know where to find us. I will see you next week. And until then, bye-bye. Hey, beauties and bees, welcome back to the show. Okay, fair warning, today we are going to take a detour from the paranormal. But don't let that fool you into thinking that this is going to be easier to hear. Ghosts, monsters, things that go bump in the night, we can tell ourselves those aren't real. We can just close the tab and go to sleep. What happened in 1939 in a small orphanage in Iowa, that was very real. Every detail of it was real. And the people responsible didn't have fangs or claws or anything you could point to and call a monster. They had lab coats and university offices and the complete trust of the people around them. That is what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into the monster study. It was 1939 in America. There was a small orphanage tucked away in a little town. Kids who'd lost their parents lived there under the care of the state. Then one day, a group of researchers showed up. They had a pretty convincing cover story. They were there to run a charitable study to help the children's development. But what those researchers secretly started doing inside that orphanage had nothing to do with charity. Years later, people would give that study a terrifying name: the Monster Study. And here's the thing about that name. It wasn't journalists who came up with it. It wasn't outraged strangers who read about it decades later. It was Johnson's own graduate students, people who worked alongside him and knew what he'd done, who started calling it that among themselves in the 1940s and 50s, quietly, privately, while Johnson kept collecting awards. He knew they called it that, but he just kept going. So what exactly did these researchers do in that orphanage? And what happened to the kids trapped inside it? The story goes back to the University of Iowa in 1939. This was during the darkest days of World War II, when the whole world felt like it was falling apart. Late one night, long after everyone else had gone home, the lights in one psychology lab were still on. That lab belonged to one of the most brilliant and most tormented minds in American speech pathology at the time. His name was Wendell Johnson. Johnson was deeply respected by his peers. But behind all that prestige, he was hiding something he'd never told anyone. As brilliant and accomplished as he was, this man had spent his entire life in pain because he had a severe stutter. It had followed him since childhood. He tried every treatment available and nothing worked. The stutter stayed. Every time Johnson opened his mouth, his lips would freeze. He was just talking. For Johnson, it felt like running into a wall every single time. So he poured every ounce of his academic passion into one subject: stuttering. Why do people like me have to struggle with this our whole lives? Why can some kids talk effortlessly while others can't even get their first word out? These questions consumed him. At the time, the scientific consensus was that stuttering was a genetic defect, something you were born with, something you couldn't fix. It was treated as a physical disability, plain and simple. No cure, no treatment. End of story. But Johnson couldn't buy that. Having lived with it himself, he felt in his gut that it wasn't some built-in physical flaw. He arrived at a radical new theory. Stuttering was something that developed after birth, triggered by the way other people reacted to a child's speech. He would eventually put it this way: stuttering begins not in the child's mouth, but in the parent's ear. And his idea went something like this. When a little kid is first learning to talk, they naturally stumble over their words sometimes. That's completely normal. But if the adults around them overreact, if a parent or teacher singles the child out and says, "You stutter," that label gets burned into the kid's brain. And that label ends up silencing them for good. If he could prove that theory, he believed, he could save countless kids from a lifetime of struggling to speak. And around the same time, Johnson was keeping a private journal. In the journal, he wrote about a quiet, growing fear that his own 5-year-old son, Nicky, might pick up his stutter by imitating him. He documented his anxiety about it in careful detail, watching the boy's speech patterns, noting every hesitation,